Maya Patel had exactly three things going for her at Galactic University: a stubborn streak that could outlast a neutron star, an uncanny ability to memorize alien anatomical structures she'd never actually seen, and the worst sense of direction in 17 known star systems. Which is how she found herself standing in the doorway of Nebula's End Café, white cane tapping frantically while her other hand clutched a datapad that was supposedly reading her the day's specials in a voice that sounded like a malfunctioning food processor. "Grilled quantum fish with a side of temporal salad," she muttered, giving the device a shake. "Either this thing's broken, or the chef's having an existential crisis." The cafe had gone suspiciously quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet where people politely lower their voices when someone's clearly lost. No, this was the kind of silence that usually preceded either a surprise party or a public execution, and given her luck with social situations, Maya was betting on the latter. She took a tentative step forward, cane sweeping left and right, and immediately collided with what felt like a small moon covered in scales. "Oh, sorry," she said, steadying herself against what she assumed was someone's impressively muscled arm. "I'm looking for an empty table, preferably one that doesn't require advanced navigation skills to reach." A sound rumbled from above her, deep throaty, like a volcano clearing its throat. When the voice finally came, it was carefully measured, as if each word was being weighed for potential diplomatic incidents. "You may sit, if you wish." Maya's face lit up. "Really? Thanks. I'm Maya, by the way. Xenobiology major, 3rd year, professional bump into things specialist." She felt around until her hands found the back of a chair, then plopped down with the grace of a bag of cement. "What's your major?" There was another long pause. Around them, Maya could hear the distinct sounds of chairs scraping, footsteps hurrying toward exits, and what might have been someone whimpering. "Must be finals week," she thought. "Everyone's stressed." "I study conquest strategies," came the careful reply. "Oh, cool, military history. My roommate's doing that. Says it's all about understanding the psychology of conflict and power dynamics." Maya fumbled with her datapad, finally managing to get it to read her notes in a slightly less mechanical voice. "I'm actually supposed to be studying the respiratory systems of draconian species today. Want to hear something weird? According to my textbook, they have these secondary air sacs that can store enough oxygen for like 6 hours of sustained fire breathing. Can you imagine?" The silence stretched so long Maya wondered if her table companion had spontaneously combusted from boredom. "That is remarkably accurate," the voice finally said, with what sounded like grudging respect. "Right, I mean, I've never actually met a draconian, obviously. They're all off doing warlord things in distant galaxies. But the anatomy is fascinating from a purely academic standpoint." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Between you and me, I think most of them are probably just lonely. I mean, when your species is famous for conquest and intimidation, it's got to be hard to make friends." Another rumble, this one sounding almost amused. "You believe the draconian warlords are lonely? Well, yeah, think about it. You spend all day being terrifying and powerful. Everyone either runs away or tries to kill you, and meanwhile you've got this complex emotional inner life that nobody bothers to explore because they're too busy being scared of your fire breath." Maya gestured enthusiastically, nearly knocking over what sounded like a very large beverage. "It's like being trapped in your own reputation, you know?" The rumbling sound came again, longer this time. "I had not considered that perspective. Most people don't. That's why I like xenobiology. Everyone focuses on the scary parts, the weapons, the territorial behaviors. But I want to understand how they think, how they feel." She paused, head tilted. "You have a really interesting voice, by the way. Very resonant. Are you from a low-gravity world? Your vocal cords sound like they're built for projecting across vast distances." If Maya could have seen the expression on Krexther the Decimator's face at that moment, she might have understood why the cafe was now completely empty except for the two of them and one very nervous barista who was apparently too terrified to leave his post. The next day, Maya returned to Nebula's End Café, like a homing missile with a faulty guidance system. She bumped into exactly 4 patrons. 2 serving drones, and what might have been a decorative plant before finally locating her table from yesterday. Or at least, she hoped it was her table. The chairs felt the same, and there was that same carefully modulated rumbling voice that sounded like distant thunder with commitment issues. "Oh good, you're here," she announced, settling into her chair with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a study partner who didn't immediately make excuses about remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. "I brought my comparative anatomy notes. Want to help me practice species identification?" Krexther the Decimator, terror of 7 sectors, crusher of rebellions, and bane of democratic processes, stared at the small human who'd just asked him to help with homework. In his 3 centuries of existence, he'd commanded fleets that blotted out suns, negotiated treaties that reshaped galactic borders, and personally conquered 47 worlds. But he had never, not once, been asked to study with someone. "I suppose that would be acceptable," he said carefully. Maya's datapad began reading descriptions in its cheerfully mechanical voice. Species designation: Zephyrian slug people. Notable features: 17 ventral breathing chambers, expandable throat sacs for long-distance communication, and a tendency to secrete protective mucus when threatened. "Fascinating," Maya said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "Krex, what do you think their social structure would be like? I mean, if you're basically a giant slug that can talk, how do you organize a civilization?" Krexthar considered this. He'd conquered the Zephyrians 3 decades ago. Lovely people, actually. Very organized. They likely operate in pod-based hierarchies. Small family units that expand into larger community clusters. Their mucus secretion suggests they value protective cooperation over individual achievement. Maya sat up straighter. "That's brilliant. How did you come up with that analysis?" "I have extensive experience with diverse species," Krexthar said, which was technically true if you ignored the context of that experience involving orbital bombardment and surrender negotiations. "You must be one of those exchange students from the Outer Rim. The xenobiology department there is supposed to be amazing." Maya made a note on her datapad. "Okay, next one. Crystalline choir singers of Harmony Prime." This time, Krexthar didn't hesitate. Silicon-based lifeforms with internal resonance chambers. They communicate through harmonic frequencies, and likely organize their society around musical consensus building. Their settlements are probably designed as massive acoustic instruments. Maya's mouth fell open. "Have you actually studied these guys?" "Because that's exactly what Professor Quentin said in last week's lecture. Only he took 40 minutes and 3 holographic displays to explain it. I am a dedicated student." "Dedicated is right. What's your secret?" "Photographic memory. Intensive study schedule. Deal with dark forces." "Something like that," Krexthar muttered. They continued through Maya's study guide, with the galaxy's most feared warlord providing detailed insights into the anatomical and cultural characteristics of species he'd personally conquered, enslaved, or negotiated with. Meanwhile, Maya took notes with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a study partner who understood that xenobiology was more than just memorizing which end of an alien the teeth came out of. "You know what I love most about studying all these different species?" Maya said during a break, while attempting to locate her coffee cup through a process that involved more hand-waving than strictly necessary. "What?" Krexthar asked, genuinely curious. It had been approximately 2 centuries since anyone had asked him what he loved about anything. "It's the diversity. Everyone's adapted to their environment in these amazing ways. Like, you've got these crystalline singers who've turned their entire bodies into musical instruments, and the Zephyrian slug people who've made cooperation into an art form. It's like the universe is this incredible experiment in what's possible when you just try different approaches to existence." She paused, head tilted in his direction. "I bet most people don't think about it that way. They probably just see the differences as threats or obstacles instead of opportunities to learn something new." Krexthar stared at her. This small human who couldn't see his battle scars, or the fear in other patrons' eyes, who looked at the galaxy's incredible diversity, and saw wonder instead of resources to exploit or enemies to defeat. "You have a unique perspective, Maya Patel." "Thanks. My mom always said I was too curious for my own good." "She's probably right, but where's the fun in playing it safe?" Maya grinned. "Same time tomorrow. I've got a whole section on predator-prey relationships among spacefaring species." As she gathered her things and tapped her way toward the exit, Krexthar realized he was already looking forward to tomorrow's study session, which was, quite possibly, the first time in his life he'd looked forward to anything that didn't involve the systematic subjugation of entire civilizations. The barista, who'd been watching this entire exchange from behind the counter with the expression of someone witnessing a cosmic joke unfold in real time, finally worked up the courage to approach the table. "Sir?" The human. "She doesn't know who you are, does she?" Krexthar's golden eyes followed Maya's retreating figure as she successfully navigated around only 2 obstacles on her way to the door. "No," he said quietly. "She does not." By the 3rd week of their impromptu study sessions, Krexthar had developed what he could only describe as a scheduling conflict of galactic proportions. On one hand, he had a vast interstellar empire that required regular terrorizing to maintain proper order. On the other hand, Maya had started bringing homemade cookies to share, and they were discussing the mating rituals of the tentacled philosophers of Nexus 9, which was honestly more engaging than most of his recent military briefings. He was midway through explaining the complex philosophical courtship debates that preceded Nexus 9 reproduction when his personal communicator began emitting the specific sequence of beeps that meant either the galaxy was ending or his lieutenant needed help opening a particularly stubborn jar of pickles. "Excuse me," Krexthor rumbled, fumbling with the device while trying to angle it away from Maya's incredibly perceptive hearing. "Lord Krexthor." The voice of Commander Vex crackled through with all the subtlety of a supernova. "The rebellion in the Cygnus sector has been crushed. Their leaders beg for mercy. What are your orders for the survivors?" Maya perked up with interest. "Oh, is that your strategy game group? I didn't know you guys played during the day." Krexthor stared at her, then at his communicator, then back at her. "Yes," he said slowly. "My strategy game. Very immersive. Realistic sound effects. Cool, what's the scenario?" "The Cygnus campaign," Krexthor replied, which was technically accurate. "We're playing a Rebels versus Empire." Commander Vex's voice continued crackling through the comm. "Sir, the Rebels? What should we do with them?" Maya leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, I love these kinds of games. What's your character like? Are you the strategic mastermind type or more of a frontline warrior?" "I am the Supreme Commander," Krexthor said weakly. "Awesome. So what's your strategy for dealing with the Rebels? I bet you're one of those players who tries to find creative solutions instead of just crushing everything with brute force." Krexthor looked at his communicator, where Commander Vex was waiting for orders that would determine the fate of approximately 6 million rebel prisoners. He looked at Maya, who was waiting with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed he was capable of creative, non-violent problem-solving. Tell the other players that the rebels should be offered terms, rehabilitation programs, job training, integration into the existing power structure through diplomatic channels." The silence from his communicator was so complete that Krexthor wondered if the device had spontaneously achieved enlightenment and decided communication was meaningless. "Sir?" Commander Vex's voice finally squeaked. "Did you just say, rehabilitation? That's brilliant," Maya exclaimed. "Most players would just go for the military victory, but you're thinking about long-term stability and social integration. That's next-level strategy gaming right there." Krexthor felt something strange happening in the region where he assumed his heart was located. It was warm and slightly uncomfortable, like indigestion but more pleasant. Yes, long-term stability is important. You know what your problem is, Krex," Maya said, settling back in her chair with the confidence of someone about to dispense life advice to an interstellar warlord. "You don't give yourself enough credit. I can tell you're really thoughtful about this stuff, but you always sound so uncertain when you talk about your strategies." "I am uncertain," Krexthor admitted, which was possibly the first time he'd said those words in 3 centuries. "But that's good. Uncertainty means you're considering multiple perspectives, thinking about consequences. That's what good leaders do." Maya paused to take a sip of her coffee, managing to locate the cup on only the second try. "I bet your gaming group really respects your tactical decisions, even if you don't always feel confident about them." Commander Vex's voice crackled through again. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You've never offered rehabilitation to anyone before. Usually it's more, you know, orbital bombardment and public executions." Maya frowned. "Wow, your friends really commit to the roleplay, don't they?" That sounded genuinely concerned. "They are very dedicated to their characters," Krexthor managed. "Well, tell them their Supreme Commander appreciates their dedication but is exploring new strategic approaches based on recent educational insights." Krexthor repeated this message almost word for word because honestly, it was the most accurate description of his current situation that he could think of. After ending the communication and spending another hour helping Maya memorize the digestive cycles of methane-breathing cloud dwellers, Krexthor found himself walking slowly back to his flagship. For the first time in his very long life, he was questioning whether there might be alternatives to his traditional approach of conquering first and asking questions later. It was a deeply unsettling feeling, almost as unsettling as the realization that he was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow's study session, where Maya had promised to bring her notes on psychological profiles of galactic leadership figures throughout history. He had a sinking suspicion that particular study session was going to be very educational indeed. Maya burst into Nebula's end café with the kind of frantic energy that suggested either a breakthrough scientific discovery or a complete academic meltdown. Given that she immediately walked into a chair, ricocheted off a support beam, and somehow managed to tangle her cane in what sounded like a decorative wind chime, Krextor was betting on the latter. Krex, thank the cosmic void you're here, she announced, finally locating their usual table through a process that involved more collision detection than most spacecraft navigation systems. I need your help with the biggest assignment of my academic career, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to fail spectacularly. Krextor, who had been enjoying what he'd learned to recognize as a peaceful moment before the inevitable chaos of Maya's arrival, set down his coffee with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that sudden movements around his study partner often resulted in unexpected projectiles. What is the assignment? He asked, though he had a growing suspicion that he wasn't going to like the answer. Maya pulled out her datapad and activated the display reader, which immediately began reciting in its cheerfully mechanical voice. Assignment: Psychological Profile Analysis. Choose one historical or contemporary galactic figure known for military conquest or political dominance. Analyze their psychological motivations, leadership strategies, and potential for rehabilitation or diplomatic integration. Minimum 10,000 words. Due date: next Tuesday. Krextor felt something cold settle in his primary stomach. And you have chosen to study, Krextor the Decimator. Maya announced with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just volunteered to psychoanalyze a natural disaster. I know, everyone's going to pick the obvious ones like Emperor Maximus or the Void Queen. But I think there's something really interesting about Krextor's whole deal. The galaxy's most feared warlord sat very, very still. His deal? Yeah? I mean, look at his reputation. Terror of 7 sectors, crusher of rebellions, bane of democratic processes. Classic overcompensation behavior, right? Think about it. Maya leaned forward with the intensity of someone who discovered the unified theory of everything. Nobody gets that kind of grandiose title collection without some serious underlying psychological complexity. Krextor made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been the noise a small animal makes when caught in a trap. And here's the thing, Maya continued, completely oblivious to her study partner's increasing distress. I've been reading all these military reports and historical analyses, and they all focus on his tactical brilliance and strategic innovations. But nobody talks about the pattern. What pattern? Krextor asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know. He's been getting less violent over time. Like his early conquests were all orbital bombardment and public executions. Classic shock and awe intimidation tactics. But his recent campaigns have involved way more negotiation, prisoner rehabilitation programs, even some kind of interspecies cultural exchange initiatives. Maya pulled up her research notes. The Battle of Cygnus Sector just last month. He offered the rebels integration into his existing power structure instead of just crushing them. That's not the behavior of a mindless conqueror. That's someone who's evolving. Krextor stared at her. You believe he is evolving? Absolutely. And I think I know why. Maya grinned with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a puzzle that had been bothering her for weeks. He's lonely. The cafe went very quiet. Even the background hum of the air recycling system seemed to pause in anticipation. Lonely. Krextor repeated carefully. Think about it from his perspective. You spend centuries being this terrifying figure that everyone either runs from or tries to kill. You're incredibly powerful, probably incredibly intelligent based on his strategic innovations, but you can't have normal relationships because of your reputation. Everyone who approaches you either wants something or is plotting your destruction. Maya paused to take a sip of her coffee, completely unaware that she was performing impromptu therapy on her subject. So what do? You keep conquering because it's the only form of interaction you know, but over time you start looking for alternatives. You start trying to build something instead of just destroying it. Because deep down what you really want isn't to rule the galaxy, you want to belong somewhere. Krextor found himself leaning forward despite himself. And you believe this loneliness could be addressed through therapeutic intervention. Not just therapeutic intervention, social integration. The guy needs friends, Krex. Real friends who see him as more than just his reputation. Maya's voice took on the passionate intensity she usually reserved for discussing particularly complex alien digestive systems. I bet if someone actually took the time to get to know him, to understand his perspective, they'd find out he's not this monster everyone thinks he is. He's just misunderstood. Misunderstood, Krextor echoed. Exactly. I mean, imagine if you had to live your entire life with everyone being terrified of you. Imagine never having a single conversation where the other person wasn't either trembling in fear or calculating how to stab you in the back. Wouldn't that make you kind of desperate for genuine connection? Krextor was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Maya had ever heard it. What if this individual's reputation was earned? What if he had done terrible things? Well, sure, he's probably made some questionable choices, but people can change, right? I mean, look at his recent policy shifts. Someone who was truly irredeemable wouldn't be capable of that kind of strategic evolution. Maya reached across the table and, through pure coincidence, managed to pat Krextor's massive clawed hand. Besides, I think judging someone entirely by their past actions without considering their capacity for growth is pretty much the definition of prejudice. Krextor stared down at the small human hand resting on his scales. In 3 centuries of existence, no one had ever touched him without either reverence, fear, or the intention of causing bodily harm. This casual friendly contact was so foreign to his experience that he wasn't entirely sure how to process it. You have a remarkable capacity for empathy, Maya Patel, he said quietly. Thanks. Though my roommate says I'm naive for thinking the best of people. She's probably right, but I'd rather be wrong about someone being good than wrong about someone being evil, you know? Maya pulled her hand back and returned to her notes, completely missing the fact that Krextor continued staring at the spot where her hand had been long after she'd moved on to discussing her research methodology. So here's what I'm thinking for the paper structure, she continued. Introduction covering his early career and reputation. Analysis of his psychological profile based on behavioral patterns, examination of his recent strategic evolution, and then a proposed rehabilitation framework that could theoretically integrate him into galactic society as a productive, non-conquering member. You believe such integration would be possible? Krextor asked. Why not? He's clearly intelligent, strategically gifted, and based on his recent policy changes, capable of growth and adaptation. Put him in the right environment with the right social support system, and I bet he could be a completely different person. Maya grinned. Heck, I bet he'd make a great teacher. Can you imagine having someone with his tactical experience running strategic studies seminars? Students would learn more in 1 semester than most people learn in a lifetime. Krextor made another one of those small animal sounds. The only problem is, I need to interview someone who's actually studied his psychological profile in depth. All the academic papers I can find are just military analysis. I need someone who understands the personal motivations behind his strategic choices. Maya sighed dramatically. I don't suppose you know anyone who's done serious research into Krextor's psychology. Krextor looked at Maya, who was waiting expectantly for his response. He looked at her research notes, which contained a psychological analysis of his own behavior that was more insightful than anything his own strategic advisors had ever provided. He looked at her face, open and trusting and completely convinced that he was just another student who might have some useful academic insights to share. I believe, he said carefully, I might be able to help you with that interview. Maya had spent the better part of 3 days rehearsing her presentation, which mostly involved pacing around her dorm room while gesticulating wildly and occasionally walking into furniture. Her roommate had finally threatened to move out if Maya didn't stop practicing her opening line about the fundamental misunderstanding of galactic leadership psychology in contemporary academic discourse. So she'd taken her rehearsal schedule to the only place she knew she could count on a supportive audience. Nebula's End Café. Okay, Krex. One more time through the whole thing, she announced, settling into her usual chair with a stack of note cards that she'd organized by touch into what she hoped was the correct order. Professor Hendricks says this presentation could determine my final grade, so I need to make sure I don't accidentally skip over any crucial points or, fall off the stage. Krextor, who had been dreading this day ever since Maya had asked for his help with her psychological analysis, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. Over the past week, he'd provided her with what he described as insights from extensive research into Krextor's strategic decision-making patterns, which was technically accurate if you ignored the part where the research consisted of 3 centuries of personal experience and several recent existential crises. Perhaps, he suggested hopefully, you could postpone the presentation. Academic schedules are often flexible. Are you kidding? I've been working on this for weeks. Besides, I think I've actually figured something out that nobody else has considered. Maya shuffled through her note cards with the confidence of someone who'd accidentally stumbled onto a groundbreaking discovery. Thanks to all your help with the psychological analysis, I think I can prove that Krextor the Decimator isn't actually the monster everyone thinks he is. Krextor made a sound like a deflating balloon. Maya, perhaps there are some aspects of his character that you haven't fully considered. Like what? The orbital bombardments? The public executions? The whole terror of 7 sectors thing? Maya waved dismissively. That's all surface-level intimidation tactics. Classic defensive behavior from someone who's never learned how to form genuine emotional connections. What if those weren't defensive behaviors? Krexther asked quietly. What if they were simply the actions of someone who enjoyed causing fear and suffering? Maya paused in her card shuffling and turned toward him with the expression she usually reserved for particularly dense passages in her textbooks. Krex, have you been listening to anything I've said over the past month? People don't enjoy causing suffering unless they're damaged by their own pain first. And look at his recent policy changes. The rehabilitation programs, the diplomatic initiatives, the cultural exchange projects. That's not the behavior of someone who enjoys violence. That's someone who's finally found an alternative. She leaned forward with renewed enthusiasm. And here's the really interesting part. According to the timeline I've put together, his most significant strategic evolution has happened over the past few weeks. Something triggered a major shift in his psychological approach to leadership and conflict resolution. Krexther went very still. Something triggered it. Yeah, I think he must have had some kind of meaningful social interaction that challenged his existing worldview. Maybe he met someone who treated him like a person instead of a monster. Someone who saw his potential instead of just his reputation. Maya grinned. It's like therapeutic intervention through accidental friendship. Accidental friendship. Krexther repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Exactly. Can you imagine? This feared Galactic Warlord finally encounters someone who doesn't run away screaming, someone who actually listens to what he has to say and treats him with basic respect and kindness. It probably completely rewired his understanding of interpersonal relationships. Maya stood up and began pacing excitedly, which in the confined space of their cafe table area looked like an elaborate interpretive dance about academic discovery. I bet he'd never experienced genuine friendship before. Never had someone who enjoyed his company without ulterior motives. Never had casual conversations about shared interests or someone who brought him homemade cookies just because they thought he might like them. Krexther's golden eyes followed her movements with growing horror and something that might have been wonder. You believe cookies were a significant factor in his psychological development. Well, not just cookies obviously, but small acts of kindness, expressions of genuine care, treating him like his thoughts and opinions matter. All the basic components of friendship that most people take for granted. Maya paused in her pacing. You know what the really beautiful part is? I bet whoever befriended him has no idea how much impact they've had. They probably just think they're being normal and nice, while actually providing therapeutic intervention for one of the galaxy's most psychologically complex individuals. Maya, Krexther said, his voice carrying an odd urgency. What if this person you're theorizing about? What if they discovered who he really was? What if they learned his true identity? Maya considered this seriously. Well, that would definitely be a shock. I mean, finding out your friend is actually a legendary warlord would require some major psychological adjustment. She tilted her head thoughtfully. But if the friendship was genuine, if it was based on real connection and mutual respect, I don't think it would fundamentally change anything. The person they got to know, the one who helped them with homework and listened to their theories about alien respiratory systems, that person would still be real. The reputation and the title are just external context. You believe the friendship would survive such a revelation? If it was real friendship? Absolutely. I mean, you'd probably be pretty annoyed that they weren't honest with you from the beginning, but... Maya shrugged. People have complicated pasts. What matters is who they choose to be now, and how they treat the people they care about. Krexther stared at her for a long moment, processing the fact that Maya had just described the exact philosophical framework that could potentially allow him to maintain the first genuine friendship of his existence even after she learned the truth about his identity. Now come on, Maya said, gathering her presentation materials. You promised you'd come to my presentation for moral support. I figure if I can explain Krexther's psychological complexity to someone as analytically minded as you, I can probably handle a room full of xenobiology professors. An hour later, Maya stood at the front of Lecture Hall 7, facing an audience of approximately 30 professors, graduate students, and curious undergraduates who'd heard rumors about the student who was attempting to psychoanalyze the galaxy's most feared. At the back of the room, trying to look inconspicuous, despite being roughly the size and coloration of a small building, Krexther had managed to find a seat that allowed him to observe without being clearly visible from the front of the room. The fundamental misunderstanding of galactic leadership psychology in contemporary academic discourse, Maya began confidently, stems from our tendency to analyze powerful figures through the lens of their public actions without considering the underlying emotional and social factors that drive those behaviors. She clicked to her first slide, which displayed a timeline of Krexther's major military campaigns. Take for example, Krexther the Decimator. Standard military analysis focuses on his tactical innovations and strategic victories. But when we examine the pattern of his decision-making over time, we see clear evidence of psychological evolution. Professor Hendricks, a elderly Alterian with tentacles instead of arms, raised one appendage. Miss Patel, are you seriously suggesting that we should psychoanalyze active military threats instead of focusing on practical defensive strategies? I'm suggesting that understanding the psychological motivations behind seemingly aggressive behavior might be more effective than traditional defensive approaches, Maya replied. Especially when that behavior appears to be evolving toward less violent alternatives. She clicked to her next slide, which showed her analysis of Krexther's recent policy changes. Over the past several months, Krexther's approach to conquest has shifted dramatically. Instead of orbital bombardment, we see negotiated settlements. Instead of public executions, we see rehabilitation programs. Instead of territorial expansion, we see cultural exchange initiatives. A graduate student in the third row raised her hand. But couldn't that just be strategic misdirection, making his enemies think he's gone soft before launching a major offensive? Maya shook her head. The pattern is too consistent and too resource-intensive to be strategic deception. These programs require significant long-term investment and genuine commitment to diplomatic solutions. You don't implement comprehensive prisoner rehabilitation frameworks as a military feint. She clicked to her psychological analysis slide, her voice gaining confidence as she moved into her theoretical framework. What we're seeing is the behavioral evolution of an individual who has recently discovered alternatives to the isolation and defensive aggression that have defined his existence. In clinical terms, we're witnessing therapeutic breakthrough through accidental social intervention. Professor Hendricks looked skeptical. You're anthropomorphizing a known galactic threat based on speculative psychological theory. Am I? Or am I recognizing that intelligence and emotional complexity aren't limited to species that look like us? Maya's voice carried the passionate intensity that Krexther had learned to associate with her most deeply held convictions. We study the social structures of crystalline singers and the philosophical traditions of tentacled beings. But we refuse to consider that a draconian warlord might have the same capacity for growth and change that we'd expect from any other intelligent species. She clicked to her final slide, which outlined her proposed rehabilitation framework. Krexther the Decimator represents an opportunity for unprecedented diplomatic breakthrough, not through military defeat or containment, but through the kind of genuine social integration that acknowledges his capacity for positive contribution to galactic society. At the back of the room, Krexther listened to Maya defend his potential for redemption to a room full of academics who considered him a monster to be studied and defeated. She spoke about his psychological complexity with the same enthusiasm she brought to discussing alien digestive systems, as if the possibility of his rehabilitation was simply another fascinating puzzle to be solved through careful analysis and patient understanding. The key factor, Maya continued, appears to be the presence of genuine social connection, someone who treats him as an individual rather than a symbol of galactic threat, someone who— The lecture hall doors burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Campus security officers poured in, followed by what appeared to be half the faculty of the military strategy department, all of them armed with stun weapons and expressions of barely controlled panic. Everyone remain calm, shouted Security Chief Martinez, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested this was very much not a drill. We have confirmed reports that Krexther the Decimator is on campus. Evacuation protocols are now in effect. The lecture hall erupted into chaos. Students and professors began pushing toward the exits while security officers took defensive positions around the room. At the back of the hall, Krexther rose slowly from his seat, his massive frame finally becoming visible to the people at the front of the room. Maya, who had been in the middle of explaining her theoretical framework for diplomatic engagement, stood frozen at the podium as the noise and commotion swirled around her. Maya, Professor Hendricks called out, his tentacles writhing with agitation. Get away from the front of the room. Take cover. But Maya wasn't moving toward cover. She was standing perfectly still, her head tilted in the listening posture that Krexther had learned to recognize as her thinking expression. The chaos of voices and movement around her seemed to fade as she processed the distinctive sound of footsteps she'd been hearing every day for the past month. Heavy. Measured. The specific rhythm of someone who was accustomed to having others move out of their way.
Footsteps that were now approaching the front of the lecture hall with deliberate, careful precision. "Krex," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the commotion. "Yes, Maya," came the familiar rumble from directly behind her. "It is me." The lecture hall went dead silent. Every person in the room turned to stare at the small blind human standing next to the galaxy's most feared warlord, who was looking down at her with an expression that nobody could quite interpret. Maya turned slowly to face him, her hand unconsciously reaching out until it found the familiar texture of his scaled arm. "You're really him. Krexther the Decimator." "I am. The terror of 7 sectors." "Yes. The crusher of rebellions." "That is also accurate." Maya was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same methodical approach she brought to studying alien anatomy. Around them, security officers maintained their defensive positions while professors and students watched with the fascination of people witnessing either a historic moment or a spectacular disaster. "So when you were helping me with my homework," Maya said finally, "you were basically giving me a psychological analysis of yourself." "That is correct. And when I asked you to help me find an expert on Krexther's strategic thinking, I was the expert you were looking for." Maya nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than terrified. "Well, that explains why you were so good at explaining the respiratory systems of species from the outer rim. You've actually met them." "I have conquered most of them." "Yes, right. Obviously." Maya paused. "So the question is, are you here to decimate something? Because I'm in the middle of defending your psychological complexity to a room full of academics, and it would be really awkward if you chose this moment to prove me wrong by doing something typically warlordish." Security Chief Martinez took a step forward, stun weapon raised. "Miss Patel, please move away from the target. We have this situation under control." "Actually," Maya said, not moving from her position next to Krexther, "I don't think you do. Because if you're planning to arrest my study partner, we're going to have a problem." The silence that followed this statement was so complete that everyone in the room could hear the ventilation system cycling. "Your study partner," Professor Hendricks managed to say. "My friend," Maya corrected firmly, "who has been helping me with xenobiology homework for the past month, who listens to my theories about alien psychology, who brings me coffee when I'm stressed about exams, and who apparently has been going through some kind of major personal growth that I've been accidentally documenting in my research." She turned back toward Krexther, her voice taking on the no-nonsense tone she usually reserved for particularly stubborn datapad interfaces. "Though we are definitely going to have a conversation about honesty in interpersonal relationships, because this whole secret identity thing is a pretty significant breach of friendship protocol." Krexther, who had faced down rebel fleets, and negotiated with hostile alien empires without flinching, found himself genuinely nervous about disappointing a 5-foot-tall human with strong opinions about proper communication in friendships. "I was uncertain how you would react to learning my true identity," he admitted. "Well, now we get to find out," Maya replied. "The question is, what happens next? Are you here as Krexther the Decimator, terror of 7 sectors, here to do something terrible and dramatic? Or are you here as my friend Krex, who promised to provide moral support during my presentation about psychological rehabilitation frameworks?"
Every person in the lecture hall turned to look at the galaxy's most feared warlord, waiting to see which version of himself he would choose to be. Krexthor the Decimator, terror of 7 sectors, crusher of rebellions, and bane of democratic processes, looked around the lecture hall at 30-odd faces, staring back at him with expressions ranging from terror to fascination to what appeared to be academic curiosity. Then he looked down at Maya, who was waiting with the patient expectation of someone who genuinely believed he was capable of making the right choice. For 3 centuries, he had never had to make a choice like this. Every decision had been about power, strategy, conquest, or survival. But this small human had just offered him something unprecedented, the opportunity to decide who he wanted to be instead of who he had always been. "I am here," he said carefully, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly quiet lecture hall, "to provide moral support for my friend's academic presentation, which I believe was quite excellent before it was interrupted." The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Security Chief Martinez lowered his stun weapon slightly. "You're here for a student presentation. Maya has been working very hard on her research," Krexthor replied with the dignity of someone who was completely committed to this new reality. "Her analysis of galactic leadership psychology represents innovative thinking that deserves serious academic consideration." Professor Hendricks' tentacles writhed in confusion. But you're Krexthor the Decimator. I am also Maya's study partner, Krexthor said simply. These identities are not mutually exclusive. Maya grinned with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical framework had just been validated by empirical evidence. See? This is exactly what I was talking about. Complex psychological identity that transcends simple categorical definitions. Maya, Professor Hendricks said weakly. You've been studying with the galaxy's most feared warlord, and he's been an excellent study partner. Very knowledgeable about comparative alien anatomy, surprisingly insightful about interspecies social dynamics, and he brings really good cookies from that bakery near the spaceport. Maya paused thoughtfully. Though I guess now I know why he always seemed to have such detailed first-hand knowledge about various species' cultural practices. Security Chief Martinez looked back and forth between the small human and the massive dragon-like being, who could theoretically reduce the entire campus to smoldering rubble. Miss Patel, are you seriously vouching for Krexthor the Decimator? I'm vouching for my friend Krex, who has spent the past month helping me understand that intelligence and emotional complexity exist in forms that don't always look familiar to us. Maya's voice carried the passionate conviction that had made her presentation so compelling. And who, based on recent behavioral evidence, appears to be going through exactly the kind of psychological evolution that my research predicted was possible. She turned toward the room full of academics and security personnel. You know what the funny thing is? Everyone in this room just witnessed proof of my theoretical framework. Krex didn't come here to conquer or intimidate anyone. He came here to support a friend. That's not the behavior of a mindless destroyer. That's the behavior of someone who's learned to value relationships over reputation. But he's conquered entire star systems, one of the graduate students pointed out, though with less fear and more curiosity than before. And now he's helping undergraduates with their xenobiology homework, Maya replied. People change. That's literally the entire point of my research. Krexthor cleared his throat, which sounded like distant thunder considering its diplomatic intentions. If I may address the concerns about my presence on campus, I would like to formally request enrollment in your continuing education program. The lecture hall went quiet again, but this time it was the silence of people processing unexpected information rather than paralyzing fear. You want to enroll in classes? Professor Hendricks asked. Maya has suggested that my experience with diverse species and strategic analysis might be valuable in an academic context. I believe the phrase she used was teaching assistant for advanced xenobiology. Krexthor looked down at Maya with what might have been fondness. She also mentioned that I would benefit from coursework in diplomatic communication and conflict resolution. You want to become a teaching assistant, Security Chief Martinez repeated, as if saying it out loud might help him understand the situation. I want to learn how to use my experience constructively, rather than destructively. Krexthor replied. Maya has shown me that there are alternatives to conquest that can be more personally fulfilling and more beneficial to galactic society. Maya beamed with the pride of someone whose theoretical framework had just been validated by the ultimate test case. See? Therapeutic intervention through social integration. Exactly like I predicted. Professor Hendricks looked around the lecture hall, taking in the faces of his colleagues and students, all of whom seemed to be processing the fact that they were witnessing either a historic moment of interspecies diplomacy or the most elaborate academic hoax in university history. This is highly irregular, he said finally. So is having a blind human successfully psychoanalyze a galactic warlord without knowing who she was talking to. Maya pointed out, sometimes irregular approaches lead to breakthrough discoveries. There would need to be extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, security protocols. Professor Hendricks' tentacles writhed as he worked through the administrative implications. I am willing to submit to whatever evaluation processes are deemed necessary. Krexthor said formally. I recognize that my reputation precedes me, and that trust must be earned through consistent action, rather than proclaimed through declaration. Security Chief Martinez still looked skeptical. What guarantee do we have that this isn't some kind of elaborate infiltration strategy? Maya laughed, which seemed inappropriate, until everyone realized she was genuinely amused rather than hysterical. Have you been listening to anything we've said? If Krex wanted to infiltrate the university, he wouldn't have spent a month helping me with homework and attending study sessions in the most public cafe on campus. He would have used stealth technology and strategic planning, not cookies and comparative anatomy discussions. The cookies were very good, Krexthor added, which somehow made the entire situation feel more surreal and more believable at the same time. Besides, Maya continued, look at the evidence. His recent policy changes, his willingness to attend my presentation, his request for educational enrollment instead of territorial demands.
This is exactly the kind of behavioral evolution that indicates genuine psychological transformation. Professor Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, his tentacles still writhing as he processed the implications of Maya's research becoming a real-world case study in rehabilitation through social integration. If we were to consider such an arrangement, he said slowly, it would require approval from the university administration, the campus security committee, and probably several galactic diplomatic organizations. I understand, Krexther replied. I am prepared to work within whatever institutional frameworks are necessary. And in the meantime, Security Chief Martinez asked. Maya stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had just successfully defended her thesis under the most dramatic circumstances possible. In the meantime, I have a presentation to finish. Because whether or not Krex enrolls in classes, my research on the psychological complexity of galactic leadership figures is still academically significant. She turned back toward her presentation materials, then paused and looked over her shoulder at Krexther. Also, we still have that conversation to finish, about honesty in interpersonal relationships. Because friends don't let friends maintain secret identities for a month without some serious discussion about communication protocols. I look forward to that conversation, Krexther said, and the fondness in his voice was unmistakable. Good. Now, would everyone please sit down so I can finish explaining my theoretical framework? Because this whole situation is actually providing excellent real-time validation of my research, and I want to make sure I document it properly for the academic record. 6 months later, Maya sat in her usual spot at Nebula's End Café, reviewing her notes for advanced interspecies psychology, while her study partner graded papers from his Introduction to Strategic Analysis seminar. The café had become significantly more crowded since word had gotten out that Krexther the Decimator was now Professor Krexther, teaching assistant in the Department of Xenobiology and continuing education student in the Diplomatic Communication program. How are your students doing with the assignment on nonviolent conflict resolution? Maya asked, not looking up from her datapad. Better than expected. Several of them have developed innovative approaches to territorial disputes that I never would have considered during my conquering phase. Krexther made a note on one of the papers. Though I think student 47B may be slightly too enthusiastic about the psychological manipulation aspects of diplomacy. You'll balance that out. You're good at helping people see multiple perspectives. Maya paused in her reading. Speaking of which, how did your meeting with the Galactic Diplomatic Council go? They have officially removed me from the active threats to interstellar stability list and added me to the persons of interest for rehabilitation success stories database. Krexther sounded pleased with this development. Apparently my case study has inspired several other warlords to consider educational alternatives to conquest. Really, that's amazing. Commander Vex has enrolled in a conflict mediation program. General Zarkoth is auditing classes in cultural anthropology. The Void Queen herself has requested information about our university's graduate programs in social psychology. Maya grinned. Who knew that treating people like complex individuals instead of two-dimensional threats would lead to positive outcomes? It's almost like that was the entire point of my research. Your theoretical framework has proven quite robust, Krexther agreed. Though I believe the success of the practical application owes as much to your capacity for friendship as it does to your academic insights. Well, that's the thing about friendship, it works both ways. You helped me understand that intelligence and emotional complexity come in forms that don't always match our expectations, and I helped you understand that you're more than just your reputation. Maya reached across the table and patted his scaled hand, which had become a familiar gesture over the months. Plus, you really do make an excellent teaching assistant. Your students love those detailed case studies about interspecies diplomatic negotiations. They find my first-hand experience with diverse cultural practices educational. C. Complex psychological identity that transcends simple categorical definitions. Maya took a sip of her coffee, managing to locate the cup on the first try, which represented significant improvement in her spatial awareness skills. Though I still think you should consider writing a book about your experiences. From Conquest to Classroom, A Warlord's Guide to Career Transitions would probably be a bestseller. Krexther made the rumbling sound that Maya had learned to recognize as his version of laughter. Perhaps after I complete my coursework in diplomatic communication, I want to ensure I can tell the story in a way that emphasizes the transformative power of genuine friendship rather than simply cataloging my previous strategic failures. Good point. Though for the record, helping me pass xenobiology was definitely one of your more successful strategic achievements. I prefer to think of it as my first diplomatic success. Maya smiled, and returned to her reading, while around them the café bustled with the normal activity of students and faculty going about their daily academic lives. At nearby tables, other species worked on their own projects, occasionally glancing over at the unusual study partnership that had become a familiar and welcome sight. It was, Maya reflected, exactly the kind of ordinary, comfortable moment that she'd theorized might be possible for even the most feared individuals in the galaxy, if someone just took the time to see them as people, rather than monsters. And if they happened to bring really good cookies to share. Oh, before I forget, Maya said, pulling a small wrapped package from her bag. I stopped by that bakery you like. They had those crystalline honey cakes that you mentioned wanting to try. You brought me cookies, Krexther said, accepting the package with the careful reverence of someone who still wasn't entirely accustomed to casual acts of kindness. I brought my friend cookies, Maya corrected. Because that's what friends do. And as Krexther carefully unwrapped the honey cakes, while Maya returned to her study notes, both of them settled into the comfortable rhythm of shared academic work and mutual companionship that had become the foundation of their unlikely but genuine friendship. In the end, Maya's research had proven that even the most fearsome reputations could be transformed through the simple but revolutionary act of treating someone like a person worth knowing. And Krexther had discovered that sometimes the most powerful conquest of all was learning how to be conquered by friendship. Which was, as Maya would undoubtedly point out, exactly what her theoretical framework had predicted all along.